Some people don't break homes by accident. They do it slowly, quietly, believing they can negotiate with gravity until the fall comes, and all that's left is tears for consequences they helped create. Naomi Hart was 31 when she married Ethan Turner. Not because she woke up one morning certain he was the one, but because the alternative, admitting she'd been splitting herself in two for years, felt impossible to explain. Ethan was kind, patient in the way people are when they believe patience will be rewarded. 2 years older, which meant nothing in terms of power but everything in terms of comfort. He fit easily into her life. Her friends liked him. Her parents approved without reservation. He laughed at her jokes, remembered her coffee order, and never asked questions that required her to lie directly to his face. Tom Moore was different. 11 years older. Not old enough to be absurd, but old enough that when he walked into a room, people adjusted their posture. He had the kind of presence that made waiters apologize for things that weren't their fault. His voice carried authority even when he wasn't trying. And when he looked at Naomi, really looked at her, it felt like being chosen by someone who had the luxury of choosing anyone. She met Tom at a professional event she'd attended reluctantly. A networking conference her company had insisted she attend. He was keynote speaker. She was in the third row, checking her phone between slides. Afterward, there was wine, small talk, the usual corporate choreography of name tags and business cards. He found her near the bar, looking bored. "You looked like you wanted to leave," he said. "I did," she admitted. He smiled. "Good. So did I." It started innocently enough. Coffee meetings that turned into dinner. Dinner that turned into late-night phone calls that stretched past midnight. He was married then, separated, he said, though she never asked for proof. She told herself it wasn't her job to verify his claims. That was between him and his wife. Ethan, her boyfriend at the time, the man who would become her husband, never suspected anything. Why would he? She was careful. She compartmentalized beautifully. Tom was ambition, adrenaline, the version of herself she wanted to become. Ethan was safety, Sundays, the version of herself she could explain to her parents. When Tom's divorce finalized, he didn't ask her to leave Ethan. He didn't need to. The understanding was implicit. He had other priorities. She was supplementary, optional. And yet, she stayed in the orbit of both men, convincing herself she could manage the overlap indefinitely. At 31, Ethan proposed. It was sweet, unoriginal but earnest. A weekend trip to the coast, a sunset walk on the beach, a ring he'd saved for over 6 months. She said yes, because saying no required an explanation she didn't have. Because her friends were getting married. Because 31 felt like a deadline she was approaching too quickly. Tom sent flowers the day after her engagement was announced on social media. No card, just white lilies, expensive, fragrant, impossible to ignore. She understood the message. The wedding was small, elegant in the way weddings are when the bride is trying very hard to feel something she doesn't. Naomi wore ivory lace. Ethan wore a navy suit his brother helped him pick out. Her father cried during the toast. Ethan cried during the vows. Naomi smiled through all of it. She meant it, in the way you mean things when you're performing a role you've convinced yourself is real. Their marriage wasn't bad. That was the problem. It was fine, comfortable, predictable in ways that felt suffocating by the second year. Ethan worked steady hours at an accounting firm, came home by 6, asked about her day with genuine interest. They had routines. Friday takeout from the Thai place near their apartment. Sunday farmer's market where they'd buy vegetables they'd forget to cook. Monthly dinners with friends who talked about mortgages and school districts and children they hadn't had yet. But at night, when Ethan fell asleep easily beside her, his breathing steady and unbothered, Naomi stared at the ceiling and thought about Tom. About the last time they'd met for coffee, 3 weeks after her wedding, and he'd touched her hand across the table just briefly, just enough, and said, "You look happy." "I am," she'd lied. "Good," he'd said, pulling his hand back slowly. "You deserve that." She wanted to ask, "Then, why won't you give it to me?" But she didn't. Because asking would have required admitting she was waiting. And admitting she was waiting would have meant acknowledging she'd married the wrong person for the wrong reasons. 3 years into the marriage, Tom called. Not texted, called, which he never did unless it mattered. "I miss you," he said without preamble. Naomi was standing in her kitchen. Ethan was upstairs, Oblivious, probably reading one of his business strategy books. "You can't say that," she whispered, moving toward the window. "Why not?" "Because I'm married." "I know." A pause. Long enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. "Does that mean you don't miss me?" She closed her eyes. "It means it doesn't matter if I do. It matters to me." 3 words. That's all it took. She told Ethan she needed space. Not a separation, exactly. Just time to think. Time to figure out what she wanted. He looked at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't recognize. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked quietly. "No." "Then what is it?" "I just need to be happy." He didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't rage the way men do in movies when their wives leave them without clear reason. He just nodded slowly, packed a bag with a week's worth of clothes, and left quietly, like he'd been expecting it all along, like he'd known, somewhere deep down, that he was temporary. Naomi filed for divorce 2 months later. Clean. Amicable. Ethan signed the papers without contest, without lawyers, without drama. He asked for nothing. Just his books and his desk and the coffee maker his mother had given them as a wedding gift. Her friends asked why. She said she needed to focus on herself, find her happiness, live authentically, stop settling. They believed her, because people want to believe in second chances and courage, and women who refuse to settle for less than they deserve. No one asked if she'd left Ethan for someone else, and she never volunteered the information. Tom didn't move Naomi into his life immediately. That wasn't how he operated. There were dinners at restaurants where the menu had no prices, weekends away at boutique hotels in wine country, hotel rooms with city views and room service at midnight. He was charming when he wanted to be, attentive in bursts. He remembered details about her work, her mother's birthday, the book she'd mentioned wanting to read. But he also disappeared, days without contact. Then, a text out of nowhere, "Crazy week, miss you." And she'd respond immediately, "Miss you too." Because what else could she say? That she'd spent 3 days checking her phone every 10 minutes? That she'd started wondering if he was with someone else? Tom's ex-wife's departure was public knowledge in certain circles. She'd left him citing abuse, physical, not just emotional. There were rumors about affairs, patterns. A rotating cast of women who lasted just long enough to believe they'd changed him, then quietly disappeared. Naomi's friends warned her during a girls' night 6 months after her divorce. "You know what happened with his ex-wife, right?" her friend Sarah asked carefully. "That's her version," Naomi said, refilling her wineglass. "What's his version?" "That she was unstable. That she fabricated things to get a better settlement." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "And you believe him?" "I know him." "Do you?" Naomi did. Or she thought she did. Because the version of Tom she saw was different, softer, vulnerable in private moments. He told her things he claimed he'd never told anyone about his childhood. His father's impossible expectations, the pressure of being successful, the loneliness that came with power. "You make me feel like I can breathe," he said once, lying beside her in the dark after they'd made love. She held on to that sentence, replayed it during the weeks he didn't call, used it to justify the waiting, the uncertainty, the feeling that she was always auditioning for a role she'd never quite secure. 8 years. That's how long Naomi waited. People asked when they'd get engaged, when they'd move in together, when she'd finally post a photo of them together on social media. She laughed it off. "We're not in a rush, we're happy as we are." But she was rushing, internally, desperately. She watched friends marry, have children, buy homes in the suburbs. She attended baby showers, and smiled through questions about when it would be her turn. "Soon," she'd say, touching Tom's arm. He'd smile and change the subject. Tom never proposed, never even hinted at a timeline. When she brought it up carefully, casually, over dinner, he'd say things like, "I don't need a piece of paper to prove I love you," or "Marriage is just a legal contract." She'd nod and tell herself he was right, that they were evolved, modern, beyond traditional expectations. But at night, alone in her apartment because they still didn't live together, she'd wonder why she'd left Ethan for this, for a man who saw her on his schedule, who introduced her as Naomi at work events, never as his partner, who had a drawer for her things at his place but never offered her a key. At 39, Naomi got pregnant. It wasn't planned. She'd been on birth control. But these things happen. When she told Tom, she watched his face carefully for any sign of joy, of commitment, of clarity about their future. He didn't panic. He nodded, thoughtful, serious. "Okay," he said slowly. "We'll figure it out. Not we'll get married. Not I'm happy. Not this is what I've been waiting for. Just, we'll figure it out." She told herself that was enough. That this was the catalyst they needed. That a child would solidify things, force his hand, make him see her as permanent rather than optional. At 12 weeks, she miscarried. She was alone when it happened. Tom was traveling for work, a conference in Singapore he'd mentioned weeks ago, but she'd forgotten about. She called him from the hospital, her voice shaking. "I lost the baby," she said. Silence. Then, "I'm so sorry. I'll come back early." He didn't. Work was insane, he said when he finally returned 3 days later, with expensive flowers and takeout from her favorite restaurant. "You know how it is." "I couldn't get away." She did. She always did. After the miscarriage, something shifted. Not in Tom. In Naomi. She stopped asking when they'd move in together. Stopped hinting about rings and futures and timelines. She told herself she was being patient, mature, understanding of his complicated life. But really, she was just tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of being optional. Tired of performing the role of the cool, unbothered woman who didn't need labels or commitments. The call came on a Tuesday evening in October. Not from Tom. From a mutual acquaintance named Jennifer, who thought she should know before she heard it from someone else. "He proposed," Jennifer said carefully. Naomi laughed. Actually laughed. "What?" To Rachel, the new consultant on his team. She's 26. Silence. "I thought you should hear it from someone who cares about you." Naomi hung up, stared at her phone, waited for Tom to call, to explain, to say it wasn't true, that Jennifer was mistaken, or malicious, or both. He didn't call. She texted, "Is it true?" 3 hours later, yes. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the 8 years she'd invested, just confirmation. She called him. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was shaking. "I didn't know how." "You didn't know how?" "It just happened, Naomi." 8 years, she said, her voice breaking. "I gave you 8 years. I know. I lost a baby. Your baby. I know. Then why?" Silence stretched between them. Finally, "Because she doesn't ask questions, I can't answer." Naomi hung up. She posted online. Not the details, just enough to position herself as wounded, betrayed, used by a powerful man who dangled commitment like a carrot she could never quite reach. She expected outrage, solidarity, digital pitchforks, and canceled partnerships. Instead, didn't she leave her husband for him? She knew what he was. This is literally how she got him. What did she expect? She thought she was different, lol. The cruelty wasn't loud. It was quiet. Algorithmic. A few comments here and there. Minimal engagement. Her pain. Acknowledged, but not validated. Not defended. Friends reached out, carefully. "Are you okay?" "No. I'm sorry this happened." But they didn't say, "He's a monster." They didn't say, "You deserved better." They said, "What did you expect?" And she couldn't answer that. Because the truth was, she'd expected Tom to choose her. Eventually, after she'd waited long enough, sacrificed enough, proven she wasn't like the others, the ex-wife who'd accused him of abuse, the other women who'd come and gone. But she was exactly like the others. She just refused to see it. Months later, Naomi ran into Ethan at a coffee shop downtown. He looked the same, maybe happier, lighter. There was a woman with him, brunette, laughing at something he'd said, not clinging, not performing, just comfortable. Ethan saw Naomi, nodded politely. She nodded back. They didn't speak. Later, sitting alone in her apartment with cold tea and her phone full of unanswered messages, she thought about texting him, apologizing, explaining. But what would she say? "I'm sorry I left you for someone who left me the same way? I'm sorry I thought stability was boring until I didn't have it anymore? I'm sorry I traded something real for something that felt important?" She didn't text. Tom married Rachel 6 months later. Small ceremony, intimate, no drama. He didn't invite Naomi. She saw the photos online. The bride looked radiant in a simple white dress. Tom looked the same, smiling. confident, unbothered by the past, by the 8 years he'd spent with someone else. Naomi waited for anger, for rage, for the desire to expose him publicly, to tell everyone what he'd done, how he'd strung her along. But all she felt was tired. Tired of waiting, tired of justifying, tired of believing that if she just held on long enough, gravity would stop applying to her. She thought about writing it all down, posting the full story, making people understand what he'd done, how he'd manipulated her. But understand what? That she'd ignored every warning? That she'd mistaken attention for love? That she'd traded a good man, a man who'd loved her simply and honestly for the idea of a better one, and ended up with neither? No one wanted that story. They wanted villains and victims, clear lines, moral clarity, black and white. But Naomi wasn't a victim. And Tom wasn't a villain. He was exactly who he'd always been, exactly who his ex-wife said he was, exactly who the patterns had warned her he'd be. She'd just convinced herself she could be the exception. Years later, at a dinner party with new friends who knew nothing about her past, someone asked her if she regretted it, leaving Ethan, waiting for Tom, the years she'd spent hoping. She thought about it while the conversation continued around her. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it." "Really?" "No, because regret implies I didn't know better." "And you did?" She smiled, sad, knowing, older. "I knew. I just thought I was different." "And you weren't?" "No one is. Some people spend their entire lives believing they can negotiate with gravity. But the fall comes anyway, not because they deserve it, but because that's what gravity does."